Hi everyone, and welcome to this special episode of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides. I'm your host, Jed Brown, founder of Low Season Traveller, and some of you may know that we're working with both the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage and My Travel Research on the Tourism Expert Recovery Series, in which we're trying to help the global travel and tourism industry to recover from the devastating effects of the pandemic. As a part of this relationship, we've been organising a series of tourism industry webinars where we speak to global leaders from the tourism industry and seek to learn how we can come out of this current situation with more resilience. Our fifth keynote of the series was with Stuart Speirs from Silver Lining Strategy, who is the world's leading expert in sustainable events. This episode comprises of the Q&A from that session. Enjoy. Stu, thanks a million for that. Gosh, so much to unpick from all of that, but really, really interesting. I mentioned to you before off air, I've worked on events more on the B2B side. For me, learning a huge amount going through, your presentation there. I thought that, one of the really interesting points is this ability for events to shift seasonality as well. Obviously, I've got a slight bent towards low season travel anyway, but that's where my sort of ears pricked up at that part, where we can use events to shift seasonality into the low seasons, which absolutely is legitimate. Is that how most destinations, is that their number one concern when they're looking to create different events? Obviously, it's all linked to to the economy, to the good of the local population and the benefits of local population. But is a key part of this in tourism terms to start to, I suppose, not switch seasonality, but to shift people into the other lower seasons in order to make the destination more sustainable. If you've currently got hotels, if you've got seasonality where a destination is busy for 6 months of the year, but the hotels are 20% occupied for the remaining 6 months, is this the real objective behind these events, to make sure that their hotels, their restaurants and everything else are being used all year round rather than just for certain key parts of the year?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I think the extent to which it's important probably will depend on each community's individual dynamics. Some communities that I work with will welcome a visitor irrelevant of the time of year, but in a place like Sydney, for example, their hotel occupancy is generally at about 95% through December, January, February. So they're not really interested in investing in serious money in events at that time of year. And they already have existing events now on at that time as well. So I suppose it does depend on the community, but yes, I think that's a primary goal when it comes to government investment in these events, is to smooth out that occupancy curve.
How do that's a really interesting point when you're saying about Sydney, and obviously this Vivid Sydney, and I've seen it for myself, and by the way, that's just absolutely amazing as an aside. But like you say, Sydney, their tourism sort of capacity is such that year round they're 95% occupied with all of their properties and everything else. Why do they need to host an event like Vivid Sydney? Why invest in that? Do they see that much of an extra spend during that time?
They do, yeah. I think occupancy. So I suppose the thing with hotels in Sydney, when they know what 95% occupancy looks like, they probably wouldn't mind having 95% occupancy the whole time. So when May, June was sitting at 75, 80%, they were like, well, hey, Tourism New South Wales, Events New South Wales, what are you doing to help us make that 80% closer to the 95% mark? So, I think it, again, back to the locality of how important that goal is. Even if you're as blessed as somewhere like Sydney, I think it does remain an important objective.
Yeah. In terms
of the
other
thing I should mention there, sorry, Jed, as well, is a big trend with a lot of these agencies is to create an events calendar, and that calendar is something that is recurring, and is something that the hotel industry and the broader hospitality tourism industry can actually grab and go, right, we know at these times of the year, every single year, there will be uplifts in occupancy. So we can plan around that. And Melbourne's been quite brilliant at doing that. That's a really big part of them. So they have pillars, the Australian Open of tennis, the Formula One Grand Prix, they have the AFL Grand Final and the Spring Racing Carnival, 4 pillars throughout the year that the community in Melbourne, the hotel and hospitality community, taxi drivers and everyone actually know that those are times of the year they're really going to need to gear up. And that calendar has been in place for best part of, in an official sense, the best part of 15, 20 years now. So that's the other element to it as well, is it allows the industry to plan really well.
Is that, and sorry, I see Carolyn's just come here to join us.
I just wanted to add something very briefly on your question, Jed, which I think Stu touched on, but maybe to draw out a little bit, which was now in 2019, Sydney had those very high levels of occupancy year round. And as he said, you know, it was 70-85% in June, but we forget that Vivid Sydney really did make that last dip. It really smoothed that last dip through to the extent that when I tried to bring an international association conference that I was involved with to Sydney, I pretty much got told that it was very good news it wasn't in the 2 weeks of Vivid, because that had gone from the least busy time of year to the most vivid. So, you know, success always looks obvious in retrospect, but I like Stu, I remember those first few years of Vivid Sydney when we worked on it together. It didn't look like that at the beginning, and there definitely was a hole in the calendar before we had that event.
I suppose it's like anything, though, isn't it? It's you know, what's coming across from Stu's presentation is, you know, with events you have to be in it for the long haul. You know, you touched on the one-off events versus the, you know, the cyclical and repeating events. It seems to me that the real benefits are to be had if you're hosting them consistently and over a period of time, because then you get known for it, and then the industry can plan for it, the tourists can plan for it. Is that pretty much right, Stu? Is that your take, that to have the repeating events is probably the best way forward?
Yeah, because it's those repeating events that will have a really positive impact upon civic pride and local pride, community cohesion, and by extension, be really good marketing tools for that community to use. It's just a question of how you actually quantify those things to justify the spend on those events, because it's a much harder quantification to do than 2,000 people arrived and each spent $1,000, so $2 million arrived.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the challenge with justifying the spend around those two factors, is that it's just a harder thing to quantify.
Is it important to also sort of pick, you know, if you're a destination somewhere, to pick your theme? Like you were giving a great example there before of Melbourne, and you know, obviously all of those events are sporting events. They've obviously decided somewhere along the line, in some period of time, they've decided, okay, what we do is sports, and we're going to do that better than anybody in Australia, and we're just going to go for all of the big sporting events, and those are the ones which we're going to focus on. Is that is that a sort of a key part of any sort of strategy for any destination to pick their niche, their thing?
100%. It needs to remain. I think, as we all know, any marketing that doesn't ring true to the actual experience is going to be seen for what it is, surface line marketing. So it needs to be, these events need to be deeply rooted in the place itself, the psyche of the place, what they pride themselves on. In the case of Melbourne that you just bring up there, Jed, the Australian Open of tennis ended up being held in Melbourne because more people turned up to it in the 1920s than anywhere else. That's why it ended up being there. But it's actually been in about 7 or 8 different destinations over its journey, but became such an entrenched thing in Melbourne psyche that it had to remain in Melbourne because the financial figures justified it. When it comes to things like the racing carnival and things like that, that's probably not so much a good planning as much as it was a reflection of Melbourne being just a bunch of sport mad individuals that we will turn up to anything. So those examples that I've given have probably been organically grown over the years, and many years in some cases. And it's now that the government tourism bodies have come along and gone, right, let's capitalise on that and ensure that we really let the world know that we are and it's used as the tagline for Melbourne very, very often is the world's sporting event capital.
Yeah, they've been incredibly effective on it. One last question for me before we go to the questions from the audience, of which there's quite a few which have come through. You touched again in the presentation on the legacy of events, and I just wanted to sort of, unravel that a little bit more, if you will. What kind of a legacy should destinations be seeking to have as a result of hosting events?
Probably the first point is to make sure you don't trash anything. Before you start talking about legacy, let's not ruin anything. Again, the mega events are the ones that tend to be the major culprits on that. We know that a lot of the Athens Olympic infrastructure is now rotting. Who knows what's going to happen off the back of the World Cup over in Qatar in terms of how that ends up being a legacy. In terms of the positive side of that story, though, I think it's going to be very dependent upon your place and what your place is about. So if, by way of example, up in Mackay, they have very strong roots in the fishing world, maybe it's about building events that create to a much broader or a bigger legacy, that being positioning of themselves as Australia's fishing capital, by way of example, or an aquaculture capital. Does that, having that event, can that feed into a broader brand narrative where universities will put aquaculture degrees into the university that's there because of that? Will it feed into a narrative that means you can have a fishing museum or an aquatic, a naval museum there as well? So I suppose that the legacy really should feed into a much broader picture about what that place is about, would be my general thought there.
And when we talk about, civic pride, national pride, pride for your destination, for the local population, which is obviously an important part of holding a sustainable event. How do we measure that? How can we measure that, before and after? And I'm sort of thinking as I'm saying this of, Bhutan tourism. They measure this gross national happiness, and questionnaires get sent out every year to everybody. So they're kind of measuring that stuff, and they're one of the few destinations that we know of that do that. How do you, if you're a tourism destination, no matter how big or small, how do you measure that sort of national or regional civic pride before and after? How can you measure the effect of hosting those events and what effect that has had on the pride for the destination?
I really like the word pride in that, because it's a very emotive word, and to put a fine example of it, I was looking after the research around Vivid Sydney at the time, in those first few years, where we went out to a representative sample of Sydney-siders and actually asked the question across all of the events that were on there. Vivid Sydney, or we'd ask them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5. Vivid Sydney makes me proud to be from Sydney, or makes me proud to be a Sydney-sider. And we do that across every single event that we invested in. Now, the metric that one of the key metrics that we used to convince government that we were onto something pretty special with Vivid Sydney was, in fact, that response to that question amongst the representative sample of Sydney-siders. It was for those that were aware of the event, it was registering levels of pride that we had never seen from any other event. So I think it's a question of setting up replicable research processes to say, and ones that allow you to benchmark. Benchmarking is a real thing here. If we'd seen those figures for Vivid Sydney in isolation, we probably wouldn't have known we had something special. The only reason we knew we had something special is because we'd actually benchmarked it against the other 80 events that we invested in at the time.
Fair play. I'm going to move on to the questions because they're starting to flood through now. Question here, Lo from Singapore. On the question of point of difference, when Singapore started the first F1 night race, it was certainly a point of difference. Subsequently, other destinations started their own night races. Singapore immediately lost that point of difference advantage. How should Singapore respond? So when you've got that point of difference and then everybody sees that you're onto a good thing and they copy it and you lose that point of difference, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I suspect the case might be for F1, it's hard to reinvent that specific race in itself to be something that's genuinely unique in that calendar. So I'd suggest, and this is where I really love the space that I work in, is about events that are deeply rooted in the sense of place. And so for my response in Singapore would be, if you can go back into Singapore's history, and not even about the recent history since it was established as the nation we know it today, but even before that time, and find things that are unique to that place, you can create an event that can't be taken away from it, much like it has been done with the night racing for F1 that's replicable elsewhere. So find that point of difference within the DNA of your place and drive hard at emphasizing that point of difference, is what I'd say there.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you tie it into the local destination, it can't be replicated. Next point here is from Sean M. Events by nature is large groups of people in small areas of space. In the post-COVID world, do you see people engaging in real-world events like they did in the past?
Yeah, it's been looming large as the question since this has all come about. I think when it comes to sporting events, we're looking at models where, for example, here in Melbourne, where we have a 100,000 person stadium, we're talking about 30,000 people turning up to the grand final, for example, later this year. Those sporting events to me feel like just a numbers game, and it's just, right, physically this is how many can fit in, and that's all. So let's put them to one side. I think when it comes to cultural events and artistic events, they're a slightly different kettle of fish. Vivid Sydney being one of those. I touched on that little festival down in Tasmania called the Unconformity. They are exploring models which are self-guided, and you take the time to take yourself around an event footprint. It's in that space there that I think genuine innovation needs to happen and will happen, where event organisers will create self-guided tours, if you like, and itineraries that people can take themselves on in a certain period of time. And that will, in a lot of ways, end up redefining what an event actually is to us.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question there, Sean. Another question, event delivery, this is from Jenny Robb. Event delivery capacity is often the sticking point for relatively remote regional communities in Australia. How do we convince funding bodies, governments, to assist with funds to engage, employ someone like yourself to help develop business plans and strategic plans to ensure sustainability of a festival or event? So many are struggling with this.
Yeah, it's a great question and something we see a lot of. The state tourism bodies are generally pretty good. I know Tourism Events Queensland I think are very, very strong on this front. And my work in Mackay was very much funded by them. How you convince them about it, again, I do see this idea of place becoming more and more important, because if you get it right in the place, it can't be taken away from you. And so if you go to these tourism bodies and the council bodies and to say, we've got something genuinely unique on our hands here and we need to invest in it, and it's going to take 5 or 6 years, but the reason we need to invest in it is because we've got really good fundamentals and DNA in it. Please help us to do the planning and do the strategy up front to make sure that we get it right. And I think if it's pitched in the right way, there are some really good people out there that can help say to these government bodies and frame it in the language that they understand, if you like.
Do you ever find a problem with this, though, Stu, where if you're talking on a local government level, and I only bring this up because sadly we do see this certainly in Europe and in the UK specifically, where there is a short-term approach on these things. So basically it's not quite this, but look, while I'm in charge, I want something, I'm in charge for the next 5 years, it needs to be in the next 5 years. If we're looking at something longer term, then to be honest, it's harder to get on board with. Is that a little bit of a challenge as well? Because obviously what we're talking about here is you need to have a long-term sustainable approach.
Yeah.
Is that a challenge when you come across local governments that don't think that way?
100%. And you need to luck out in some ways to find yourself with support that does have a bit of vision about them. But in terms of how we go about convincing people that to come and on board and align with our vision, I think case studies are a really valuable thing to look at. So to look at South by Southwest was something we in Austin, and for anyone that isn't aware of South by Southwest, it's a monstrous event now, but it's been around for, if I'm remembering right, it's about 50 years now. If you look back at the history of South by Southwest, it didn't really do an awful lot in terms of driving any visitation for more than 10, 15 years. And that was the case study that we took to New South Wales government and said, if you want a South by Southwest, you've got to be able to put up with the lead time that they had. So I think when it comes to regional communities, to use an example like the Parks Elvis Festival, and for those that are not aware of that, Parks is quite a regional area in Australia, quite a long way from any capital cities. It has an Elvis Festival which happens in January, the hottest time of the year up there. So it's regularly 40 degrees over the course of a week. And yet people are turning up in Elvis costumes in 40-degree temperatures because they've got a genuinely unique proposition up there. Now, if you go back and look at the history of the Parks Elvis Festival, it was started by a couple blokes that started singing to each other in Elvis costumes in their basement. Now, it's sort of stayed that way as a bunch of mates getting together for the best part of 5 or 10 years before the council came in and said, we think we might have something here. Let's look a little bit more strategically at this. But the lesson remains true. Even for something like that in a regional area, the lead time before that started generating any sort of economic impact was at least 10 or 15 years. So the way to convince those local government bodies is, hey, look, if you want to have a legacy, a genuine legacy as a council, then you're going to have to think like these guys did. If you want a Parks Elvis Festival, you're going to have to wait 5 years. But come and invest with us now in the strategy and the thinking that goes behind it.
Love that. Great point there, Jenny. Carolyn, are you there? Have you gone through some of these other questions? Because there's so many. I've barely got a chance to read through them. Are you there? Oh, there you are. Hi.
I am. Yes, I am, Jed. So yes, I was looking at the length of some of the questions, thinking you're going to need my help in a minute. So I think we touched on, Jenny had asked that question. She then asked about whether they could get a mini Vivid type event in a regional area where it'd be so welcome. But I think you may have covered that one off, Stu, in terms of your answer just now about, that investment and creating it from the local things. Is there anything you wanted to add to the idea of how do we convince government to invest in a mini Vivid event in a regional area?
Yeah, the only sort of point of caution on that is that often these regional areas will say, I'd like a dark mofo, which is another big event, a very, very successful event down in Tasmania, or we'd like our version of Vivid Sydney. I just urge any destinations to think about not being someone else's something or not being our version of something. Be your own thing. Because the second that you're someone else's something, you're actually not being really, really true to yourself. So to be if you want your mini Vivid or you want your version of a Vivid, go back to your DNA, figure out a point of difference. And Vivid was rooted in this idea that per capita, Sydney actually had more creative industry employees than anywhere else in Australia and out-indexed by a long, long way. So underpinning Vivid Sydney is this idea of engagement, and that's the ideas part of the Vivid Sydney music ideas and light. The ideas part is about strengthening creative industries in Sydney, and the local engagement is very, very important part of why that strategy behind that event actually ended up working.
And I think now, Stu, in some ways, that backside of the event, the hidden bit that most of the public wouldn't necessarily see, is probably as successful in terms of attracting visitation, etc., as the more famous "Let's Light Up the Sails of the Opera House," is it not now?
Yeah. I think the thinking element of it and the ideas element of it, from memory, there's probably 45 or 50 different symposia and thinking events, sort of ideas events that are going on underpinning that more public lighting element. And you're probably right, Carolyn, I'm not 100% sure, but I'd imagine those events in their own right would drive as much, if not more, than what the lighting elements do.
Probably not in terms of the big picture visitor numbers, but I know last year every single one of those I tried to book was sold out weeks in advance. So I'm going to turn to, now we've got a really, really curly question here for you, Stu, from another Stu, this time Stu Freeman. So have some event organisers been too quick to cancel events that are essentially local or regional, i.e. in October, November, December, thus cutting a lifeline to tour operators whether the health or safety issues improve or not? So I apologise, that is a super curly question, but I think it's probably one of those questions that everyone has in their mind.
Yeah, and a very timely question in my world. So that the Unconformity down in Queenstown was cancelled officially today, and it was supposed to be on the weekend of October 21 to 23 this year. They're a very isolated remote community on the west coast of Tasmania, and they've made the decision today as well. I think it probably ends up becoming, for mine, it probably ends up becoming more a question of operational necessity than anything else. In Queenstown's case, they're not able to do it because people can't actually travel to the location and start getting things moving, which they do need to do 3 or 4 months in advance because there's a lot of installation pieces going on in the town. So they're actually restricted from doing that. So physically, it just can't happen. I do tend to think, though, if your event isn't dependent on organisers actually moving around and being there and setting things up months in advance, I'd imagine there'd be quite a lot of events that could actually probably wait until they do cancel their things a little bit longer than what they have. But it's, gee whiz, I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. I mean, my admiration for event deliverers is just unending because I'm able to sit here and pontificate about what I think's going to work and what's not, and then go, okay, off you go. And they've got to deliver it. And gee whiz, Stu, it's a great question, but I think the short answer is it's going to depend on the event itself, its individual circumstances. And Godspeed to anyone that has to make that call at this point.
Yeah, as I said, it's a super curly question, but I'll hand back to Jed on that one while I pull up the next couple of questions.
Yeah, no, it's just on that really. There was I can't figure out where it was there. But there was another question which was talking about the proliferation of virtual events as a result of coronavirus, and is there a threat, if that's the right word, that there are going to be more virtual events taking the place of physical events as a result of COVID-19?
I tend to think that's probably the case. There's definitely a threat for mine when it comes to business events. I know of business events that have now changed their model probably permanently to one that will be done both online and in place. So to that point, the business events world, I imagine, would be, it's not my specific area of expertise, but I'd imagine the business events world will be not welcoming the numbers that it used to. The Rotary conferences of the world that bring in, 20, 30,000 people from around the world, I'd sort of have a punt at saying that's probably going to half, and the other half are going to tune in from somewhere else. I'm again not my exact space of knowledge. So in terms of business events, yes, I do think that that's going to have a permanent impact. When it comes to community events and sporting events, they're sort of beholden to leagues and sort of set times when certain sports are happening and those sort of elements. So we'll put sporting events to one side. When we talk about these place-based events, the Vivid Sydneys of the world, the South by Southwests of the world, I'm a romantic when it comes to these ones, but I tend to think that they provide a platform for human connection, which probably can't happen in an online environment. And so I tend to think they're pretty unique experiences that can't be replicated. So I don't think those will be, in the long term, They won't be at the whim of an online competitor as such.
Yep, fair play. Did you have another question, Carolyn?
Well, I think the reason you were saying it was hard on this question of the moving online, Jed, was there are actually two questions, and I think you've touched on Sean's one. But there's another angle on that Felix has pulled through, which is he said, you know, how do online events as alternatives under the current scenario factor in, since they're obviously not going to generate in-destination spending? And I think it's, again, quite a curly question, but an important one. What can be the motivators for stakeholders to support online events instead?
I tend to think that the marketing and brand part of the equation is really the spot to dial up there in terms of what governments are looking for in these events. So bring online events or attach a place to online events that speak to an industry you want to develop. If IT is your space, then focus solely on events that will be delivered from your place, but to a global audience that are about specific industries. So economic goes to one side, community impact goes to one side, and it all focuses in on that marketing and brand side of the impact equation.
Question here on the sports. There's a couple of questions on the sports events, Stu, but just one very short question, but an interesting question anyway, from Hiroko-san. What is your opinion of the plausibility of the Tokyo Olympics/Paralympics 2021? Tough one for you to take, that one, eh?
I think I'd need to be an epidemiologist before anything else on that one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, look, I think I'm going to have to pass on that one, Jed. That's beyond my pay grade, that one, I think.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I suppose. Yeah. It's look. It's a hard one, Hiroko. Understand why you want to know that, but you know, to be honest, I think everybody wants to know that, and it's hard when we have a lot of these questions. It's been the same on previous sessions where, you know, you can give an opinion on it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right opinion, and it's kind of a tough one to go for. Another question here from Mark Mendes. How do you foresee the future of events in line with social distancing and other restrictions that may come in place post this pandemic? And do you see sports events taking place without a live audience in place? Yeah, interesting one then on the social distancing. So, you know, we talked last week about there's a fair chance that we're not going to live in a post-COVID world because we're always going to have some kind of a strain of coronavirus in this way. Do you think that live events, you know, this social distancing is going to change the live events that we run?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it will. And when it comes to these cultural and artistic events, it's really going to be up to them to create and curate in a lot of ways the means by which attendees can actually experience the event in their own space to a large extent. Whether you can create an event program that is in fact self-guided, and you can pick and choose where you go and the time you go, and then that speaks to the rest of the attendees that, right, these people are there at this specific time, so therefore you can't go there. That feels like something that is going to happen, is in fact something that events that I've worked with were looking at anyway before COVID, because it actually brings it back to a more personalized experience for the person themselves. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can give someone a sense of control about the experience that they have. And again, we're speaking to arts and cultural events here more than anything else, place-based events more than anything else. But yeah, I think it will have an impact and doesn't necessarily need to be seen as a negative impact either. Yep,
good point. Carolyn, any more?
Yes, there's an interesting one from Pamela, Jed, which is developing, and once she's looking to dive a little bit more into the issue of community engagement and evaluating community reactions and views. And I think it follows on from your measurement question earlier, Stu, over certain events or visitors. and how you get local residents to be directly involved and get the benefits from events. So, can you drill down basically a little bit more into community engagement, how to measure it, and how to get it, I think would be to summarize that.
Yeah, I think, and this is where a lot of my world has sort of taken me into this world of place branding. And place branding as an exercise depends on the best practice place branding I've seen depends on in-depth community consultation to a point that you understand the collective community psyche. And it's almost like an en masse collective awareness exercise, essentially, self-awareness exercise. If you can consult with enough people, have enough really in-depth conversations to distill down exactly what it is that makes someone brim with pride about being from a certain place, then take those fundamentals and put them into an event setting, people will look at an event and go, that's me, I need to be a part of it. And if you can nail that, and it's by no means an easy thing to do, but if you can nail that, then the volunteers and the people that want to work on the event and the people that want to attend the event and sponsor the event from a local point of view will come relatively organically because it's been so powerful, that statement about what we are as an event. And the example I'll have for you is an event that I worked on in a little place called Katoomba, just outside of Sydney last year. And that's in a place, the Blue Mountains in Sydney, for those of you that don't know, it's a place that prides itself on being a little bit left of centre. And in articulating the values at the heart of a business plan that I wrote for their Winter Magic Festival last year, one of the values that I wrote was unconformist. And in defining unconformist in their terms, the president of the event committee actually burst into tears because she said, I don't think anyone's actually summed who we are better than what has just been said in that business plan. So if you can elicit those sort of reactions out of people, that's why they're engaged, and they're not going to stop being engaged, because it's such a great reflection of who they are and the place that they live that it's part of them, and they can't not be involved in it because it's them.
Great point. Got a question here from John Sutherland. Hi, John. While resorts and travel operators have had to dip into marketing budgets just to survive during this crisis, will tourism bodies still have the same budgets available to invest in events, as they no doubt will have had budgets cut as well?
I tend to think they will, and I do think, I may well be a bit biased on this one, but I think events will be relatively budget cut proof in the sense that they're very easily justified in terms of return on investment. You can go, right, we invested this much in this event, this many people came, and that's a 10-to-1 return. Whereas when it comes to marketing campaigns, it's sometimes a bit harder to do that. So I do tend to think that events will come out pretty well, and particularly in regional areas where the impact is so profound and so obvious to everyone in the community. The funding for regional events outside of capital cities, I think, will probably remain the last of the budgets to be touched. Again, declaring self-interest here.
Fair play. Carolyn, any more from you?
I think that's most of the ones that I've seen, Jed. I think there's a little bit of an interesting one from Hiroko again, talking about that idea of when does that community pride tip into something that's less pleasant, that's exclusive rather than inclusive community pride. And the idea of national, I think it's a really great question, and how we manage that in our event planning. So it becomes an event where we welcome people because we're proud of where we are, rather than we shut the door because we want to keep the place to ourselves.
It's a great question. I think, wow. When the event if it can be used as an invitation for locals to actually say to outsiders, come and join us, then it's doing a really great job. I suppose that to play the devil's advocate on that point, though, if it's an event where the locals actually go, we really want it, but we don't want outsiders to come and enjoy it with us, then I'm sort of the view that, well, fine. What you want to drive, or the benefits you want to drive from this event, aren't about visitation and economic spend, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a great investment. If it contributes to a sense of civic pride and well-being and social cohesion that is really, really strong, then sure, just invest in it and make that your KPI. Don't worry about visitation.
So there you have it. Our huge thanks again go to Stuart Speirs from Silver Lining Strategy for providing us with these brilliant insights this week. And the full episode can be viewed online at wtach.org, and you can register for the future episodes, which will be running throughout May on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Until then, have a great week, stay healthy, stay safe, stay home, and don't forget to share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and social networks. Our content will always be free for everyone, as we believe that travel is better without the crowds.